Welcome to Going Antiviral, the podcast for the IAS-USA, a professional continuing medical education organization focused on HIV and other viral diseases. I'm Dr. Michael Saag, professor of medicine and infectious diseases at the University of Alabama at Birmingham and volunteer member of the IAS-USA Board of Directors. Welcome to the Going Antiviral podcast. Today, April 25th, 2025, we are speaking to Rebecca Denison, an HIV writer, educator, mother, and founder of World, Women Organized to Respond to Life-Threatening Diseases. World provides a platform for hundreds of HIV-positive women and their allies to share information, advocate for one another, and tell their stories. Today, Rebecca joins us following on her recent Martin Delaney presentation at CROI 2025 entitled 40 Years of HIV, What's Changed, What Hasn't, What Shouldn't, and What Must, which, by the way, was released in a full antiviral special podcast at the time CROI was underway. That podcast has the same title, except it's called Special Episode 40 Years of HIV, and a link of that is provided at the bottom of the access to this podcast. I really encourage everyone to listen to that because, number one, it's compelling, and it's an incredible story that she talks about, and then segues into what we can do and what we can't do. So I'm looking to this podcast to kind of pick up where she left off and really dig into some of the issues that we can address in our current environment as advocates and trying to make sure that we don't lose momentum in the fight against HIV. Rebecca, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
It's so great to have you here.
Thanks. Before we go further, I do want to make one clarification that I tried to make clear in my talk, but I don't think I did, which is that I don't work at World anymore. They don't have that newsletter anymore. I left in 2003.
Okay. Well, you still have done incredible work. And what are you focused on now?
Now I'm mostly focused on, I was mostly focused on writing until the inauguration. And now I'm mostly focused on how do we save as many lives as we can.
Yeah.
And then I'll get back to the writing. Yeah.
Well, writing is an everyday chore, right? And you've got to be committed to it every single day to make it work. But I'm glad you're still very active in advocacy. And as I said just a second ago, I'd really like to focus on where do we go from here? And I'll just take a liberty, if it's okay, and just summarize your talk at CROI. It was a Martin Delaney talk, and those of us in the HIV field know Martin Delaney, knew him. You worked with him, or at least you went to a lot of their updates at Project Inform in San Francisco as you were working through your personal journey with HIV. But in essence, what you did at CROI was incredibly powerful in just telling your story of how you found out, just trying to help a friend who was nervous about getting tested for HIV. You went and tested yourself with them, and shocked really to hear that your test was positive. It turned out your friend's was negative. And then that shock, the realization that, gosh, I may not be here for another Christmas, and the incredible story of how you came to your role in advocacy. And I think one of the most powerful parts of the talk, and there were many, was that time you went to one of the ACT UP meetings that a guy named Hank Wilson put his hand on your shoulder and said, "We need you." And boy, did you step up and take care of things. So I think everyone, I cannot endorse too much the need to go and listen to your presentation, which, like a lot of people, as I've learned over the years, people who have been through HIV challenges, telling a story is a great way to not only help people understand what's going on in the world of HIV and what it's like for an individual, but really develops a lot of empathy for folks and enables, I think, in a big picture, to reduce stigma. So thank you for all that you did with your presentation. What did I miss? Anything else from your talk that you'd really like to highlight?
Oh, no, that was great. I think that was great.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, so what I'd like to do is pick up from there. You said in your talk, you know, we need you. We need all of us since the inauguration because the current administration is sort of on a mission um, to destroy infrastructure, uh, the quote bureaucracy, which frankly we actually need to implement things. So let's start internationally because one of the first things that happened was the eradication, if you will, of USAID. And I know you've worked some in the international space. What are you hearing from colleagues or other advocates in the last, Chris Bayer, who you mentioned in your talk? What are you hearing from the field regarding the gap, the chasm that has been created from the destruction of what USAID does?
Yeah. I mean, what I've been hearing is pretty alarming, which is that often when the administration is saying that things have been turned back on, they're not turned back on. Um, which is why when I gave my talk, I gave the example of dropping an egg on the floor. You can't just undrop an egg from the floor, and that's how it has felt to me. If you shut down a clinic, you turn off the spigots, you send away the people who collect data, you rent out the warehouses that were supposed to be used for medical equipment or medications. You can't just go, oh, changed our minds, everything's fine, nobody worry. And so I'm talking to a lot of people who are really freaked out. I'm talking to people who they have their medications now, but they have no guarantee that they'll have them in the future. And one of the things I had in my talk was a recording from a young East African woman, um,
20 years old.
20 years old, born with HIV, no parents left alive. Um, and you know, but but not diagnosed at birth. And so by the time she went on medication, her CD4s were quite low. And my understanding is wherever your CD4 count was when you went on medication, that's what it's likely to return to pretty quickly. And so I'm really, really concerned about people like that woman who shared her story, who they don't have the luxury of, going off meds and waiting for our government to sort things out or waiting for their government to sort things out. Like they need to stay on medication. Whereas, I was a very slow progressor. I went 27 years before I went on medication. I've been living with HIV for 42 years, but I went 27 years without and still had 350 T cells when I started. So do I want to go back to that? No, I was pretty tired, but would I be okay for a while? I mean, I don't want to say that for anybody else, but if I had to choose between whether she got meds or I got meds, I'd give them to her.
Yeah. And so she's off meds now because of the breakdown in USAID. And I think,
No, she's on them, but she is afraid she doesn't know what's going to happen. And the other piece of that is even if we put everything back together tomorrow, the trust is gone.
yeah,
And whether you're in the United States or in any country, such a huge part of people being willing to engage in healthcare, being willing to have a clear-eyed acceptance that they have an illness, particularly a stigmatized illness, a clear-eyed willingness to take the medication, it relies on trust. And how are people supposed to trust us when we just break things and walk away? And it's not even just withdrawing things, it's breaking systems in such a way that even the 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 Africans staying, who live there and who are healthcare providers there and are trying to provide services, but their digital management systems don't work. Their patients come in and the system to know what their patients are taking are broken. And then I have a friend who just came back from Uganda a couple days ago and was interviewing people that she's known there. She's been in the HIV space for decades. since the early days of Tasso Uganda. And she was interviewing people and she was telling me about a doctor who said they haven't had any babies born with HIV in years. And now since PEPFAR was shut off, they're back to 25% vertical transmission.
which is the natural history.
Okay. And, yeah, that's what it was when I was diagnosed.
That's right.
So I'm like, it's very triggering. It's very, I'm sure I'm not the only one who's traumatized to feel it's like it's 1990, but there's no reason for it to be 1990. Not only do we have medications to prevent that, we were so close to actually really being able to imagine an AIDS free generation. Really, we were coming close. I mean, you've got long acting injectable prevention, long acting injectable treatment, and then to just, start dropping eggs on the floor left and right. It's unconscionable. Um,
And yeah, so I think the public is partially aware that USAID does more than provide food. I'm not minimizing that. That's critical. Malnutrition is a huge source of morbidity, mortality among young people, kids worldwide. And so that disappears overnight. But even though PEPFAR itself wasn't directly defunded, the implementation of PEPFAR relied heavily on USAID workers. And they get the rug pulled out from them, and then they so quote unquote reestablish it. But as just the metaphor would be, they already took the USAID title off the wall of the building. And that's kind of where it lives. And with this uncertainty, as you said, the trust is gone. And it's going to take years, maybe a decade to rebuild that. Because if I were trying to, well, we're going to get to domestic issues in a second, but if I were trying to rebuild, it's just not going to say, trust me now, that was just one president. Uh, it's damage.
yeah, yeah. And I do want to say I think there is opportunity in that. I think there's an opportunity to say, how can we be partners um, in such a way that we're saving lives, but we're not in such a position to be able to destroy them as we were before. Um, I do think people are having those conversations as well. In writing, I was in a writing class recently, and somebody said constraints breed creativity, and I thought, I think that can be true for this as well. Um, I think we will, just like COVID, I didn't know anything about Zoom until COVID. And then we all had to learn how to use Zoom. We had to. We had no choice but to adapt and change. And, um, you know, digital, what do you call it? When someone can talk to their doctor over their computer instead of going in, people were like, no, we can't have that. And now a lot of people like that. Now we've found that, that for some people, that is great. So I don't want to be only doom and gloom. I think that there are opportunities there, but I think morally it's unconscionable what we've done. Um, the number of people who are dying is, there are people dying already. Most people will not feel the impact, medically for a while. But for those people who were really vulnerable, I don't know if you saw the NPR piece about people in Zambia. And there was a heartbreaking story of a mother with an HIV positive mom and her HIV positive child, and they lost access to their meds, and the mom was fine, and the child was already symptomatic.
Yeah,
I mean, we cannot morally, we can't stand for that. That's unacceptable.
absolutely. And we did a interview at CROI with Zuzu, who is the leader of Ciders, which is in Zambia, and she was talking about that directly. So that's another podcast people can listen to. But let's segue over to the domestic issues uh, and just take USAID, the international story, as kind of a prelude. Hopefully not, but it's what created a lot of anxiety about what's going to happen in HHS regarding Ron White program, what's going to happen regarding NIH and the HIV research portfolio, especially in implementation of PrEP, with long actings or other things that we are gotten used to, reducing barriers to care and helping people with prevention. What are you sensing from the rank and file advocacy groups and patient community of their anxiety about what's next for us domestically?
Anxiety is high. Anxiety is high. Um, some will say nothing like this has ever happened before, and some will say this has happened before because there are aspects of it, the targeting of racial groups, the targeting of transgender people, the targeting of various disenfranchised people has happened before, but the scale, the cruelty, and the lawlessness of it is new. Um, and I think there may be a generational difference. It's hard for me to measure. The HIV communities that I am in are mostly older people. They're mostly people over 50. Um, we are the generation that had to fight, whether we wanted to get in the streets or not. Many of us did. Um, if we were going to survive, we had to become activists, even if we didn't want to. But the younger generation has sort of, I think, I'm not saying that it hasn't been difficult for them, but I think they've gotten a different message, which is, uh, this is a chronic manageable disease. You need to take your medication, and you'll be okay. So for those of us who lived through the period when people died for lack of access to care, people died for lack of access to housing, it's very, very triggering and very anxiety producing. So yes, we need our medications, but and those are potentially targeted. I mean, I'm on Medicaid, and the budget that they're talking about, there's no way that budget works mathematically. I'm not saying that even politically, mathematically, it doesn't work unless you cut into Medicaid. Um, so am I going to lose, my medication? I share it on the at CROI, the receipt or invoice or whatever for the last time I filled my Biktarvy prescription, and it was $12,000 for 3 months.
Yep.
I mean, who's got $4,000 a month? Not too
Elon
many
Musk,
people.
yes, he might.
Not too many people have $4,000 a month. So there's that. There's the fear of, and then there's the fear of all the other things that keep people alive. So
Sure.
housing is one, and mental health care is one, and SNAP, they're going to go after food benefits as well, is another one.
Right.
Um,
I think the history of the HIV advocacy movement, um, on one hand, benefited from the organization within the gay community in the 70s for
Absolutely.
rights, and they knew how to organize. People like Larry Kramer knew how to use fear as a motivator of people in power and was extremely good at it. And as were others in ACT UP, which he basically founded originally in New York. Um, so that was a quasi, I guess, backhanded positive. The negative we can't overstate
Yeah.
of what it was like for you and me and others watching friends die on the order of one or two a week,
Yeah.
people you knew well. And what more motivating is that to go out and do something? And even more so for someone with HIV, because, I could be next. And so
Yeah.
that's, I think, the major difference between the advocates of old and the current advocates. All the issues you said are totally valid, but the experience, the life experience coming to the table is quite different for
Yeah.
someone diagnosed 3 years ago as opposed to 35 years ago.
Yeah. Yeah. Now, I mean, there are a lot of people who have not yet been reached with PrEP, but for those who have been enjoying the benefits of PrEP, they are also at risk. Um, and I do wonder if that may bring more people to object, or they may be doing it, and I'm not seeing
Yeah.
it so
Well,
much because of
you
the
know,
circles I'm in.
So to summarize, it hasn't concretely hit yet in the United States where direct funding has been pulled. I think what we're seeing that's of concern, besides what's happened overseas, is quote reorganization of HHS. That's a concern because it felt to me like it was working pretty well before, including FDA, CDC, NIH. Watching colleagues of enormous stature, John O'Merman at CDC, Jeannie Marazzo, Cliff Lane at NIH, among many others. I'm just naming a few who are remarkably accomplished, remarkably great stewards of our federal resources, and extremely thoughtful about how to efficiently direct monies to where it's needed, and just unceremoniously fired one day or said, you can continue working, but you got to go to Alaska, for God's sakes. Um, this is what I think got all of our attention and made us feel like we were living in a fascist environment, which to me it is. So I think what
Yeah, if the most prominent people in our community, the most educated, successful, influential people in our community are not safe,
right.
then none of us are safe.
Correct. And when you hear the director of Office of Management and Budget in the White House, the executive branch, say, my job right now is to disrupt the bureaucracy, to blow things up so much that federal employees wake up every morning fearful to the point where they don't want to go to work or they're afraid to say or do anything because they'll get fired. That's not exactly management that we would all want to work for. So, with our few remaining moments, I think everyone feels the anxiety, everyone has the fear,
Yeah,
which I think you described as an emotion, but action, right?
yeah,
It's choice, I think is how you phrased it. Fear is an emotion, it's normal, let's embrace it and then redirect the energy from that into action. So, from your perspective and in your experience, what are the types of things that you're musing over that we can do collectively or individually to change this?
yeah. Yeah, the quote is fear is a reaction, courage is a decision. Um and I think everybody has certain skills and everybody has a sphere of influence. One thing I would like to see, I went to AIDS Watch this year for the first time, and I met with 6 California representatives, and they all said we need stories. So, especially those of you in your profession, you all have stories and you are well regarded by people who think clearly. So I do think getting those stories, the stories that you can tell in really succinct ways, to be sharing those stories with your congressional representatives and with the media. Um, yeah, I do think, and with everybody, I think all of us, we know people who are influential. We know people who know people who are influential. We need to be telling them stories. When my friend told me that clinic in Uganda has gone from 0% vertical transmission to 25%, I told her, I said, I'm going to be sharing that story because the people I share it with will share that story. That is an easy story to share and it must be shared. So I think we need more of that, of boiling things down and really communicating. We need to communicate clearly to people who are not scientists, and most people aren't. We need to be able to translate what's happening to why they should care, why it matters in very simple, impactful terms that also lets them know what can they do. Then they can go to their congressperson's town hall and say, what are you going to do about story X?
And it's one thing to express anger, and there's a time for that. But I think also just reason, straightforward, relatively simple messaging. It's not hard to find the message um, and to get it across to people who are otherwise reasonable but may not be aware. And stories are the way. Just I was thinking of Lin Manuel Miranda in Hamilton saying, "Who lives, who dies, who tells your story." We have to tell our story.
Right.
And speaking at an institution that I've been at for 40 some odd years, is that I love where I am. but they're afraid. They have the fear that if their faculty goes verbal too much, it could draw attention, and we end up like Harvard or Columbia or Northwestern or Penn or a lot of these places who have been targeted by the current administration. And they're very careful and appropriate, actually, to say, we can't have you speaking on behalf of the institution. I agree. But I can speak as an individual as long as I make it clear that I'm speaking as Mike Saag, not as a member of UAB faculty. And I've been doing that, but I need to do more. I want to bring something up that came out in today's April 25th by David Brooks, who conservative, right, at least historically. And he said, the Trump opponent's main job now is to maximize the amount of friction that Donald Trump faces as he tries to initiate his plans, lawsuits, leaks, non-cooperation, non-deal making, delays, and getting inside his head with psychological warfare. We have to get him off guard, get him off the rail, because if we just stand back and give it an ole and say, go on ahead, then we're going to make it too easy. And we need to, as John Lewis would say, cause good trouble.
I agree completely. We need to be doing everything we can to stop him, and we also need to be offering an alternative. You
Yes.
know, to me, the story of HIV is a love story. You know, all these people who didn't have to there were those of us who were stuck there, but there were all these people who stepped in to help who didn't have to do that. And we we offer a different version of how people can be in community with each other, how people can care for each other, how people can advocate for one another, how people can educate themselves and educate their communities. That is attractive. We need to be attracting as many people into that way of being in the world. I want to be informed. I want to help. Um, I want to be part of a community that's a caring community that lives its values rather than preaching one thing and doing another. I think we offer a lot on the positive side as well. I've gone to numerous demos and I'm like, I have friends who've been fearful for me. And I'm like, are you kidding? I feel safest there than anywhere else. The nicest people are at these demonstrations. They're the nicest people in the world.
Yeah. We need to be a sign of community of Oscar Schindlers, right? Who
Yeah.
together and just take this on, and we don't have to. There's no place for violence. There's no place
No,
for,
no, no,
but,
no, 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 no.
but there can be education. There needs to be education.
Yes.
There needs to be kind of putting things out as these disruptive activities are moving forward. Well, Rebecca, sadly, our time as I've anticipated, has flown by. And I think you've expressed this all very well. I, again, can't encourage people enough to go back and listen to your speech at the Delaney talk at CROI this year, and then come back and re-listen to this as we sort of talk about turning things into action, understanding that disruption is a cracked egg on the floor. And with the cost of eggs these days, that's even more expensive. Don't crumble in despair, I think, is also what you said.
No.
And everyone, this is the main thing, everyone has something to contribute.
Everyone does. Every
So
single
let's get
person does.
busy. Let's
Yeah.
get busy. And we
Do it.
need each other big
Yes.
time.
Yes. Yes.
Well, thanks again for being with us. It's been a joy, and
Thank you.
appreciate all you've done over the years to make a difference.
Thank you. Appreciate being on.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Going Antiviral. Catch up on earlier episodes wherever you listen to podcasts, and check out the video versions of this episode and others on the IAS-USA YouTube channel. You can find these links in the show notes, or simply go to YouTube and search for IAS-USA, and there they are. Be sure to subscribe, rate, and review Going Antiviral on Apple Podcasts. This podcast is for informational and educational purposes only and is not intended to serve as medical advice. Opinions expressed in this podcast do not necessarily reflect the opinions of the IAS-USA or its affiliates. If you have a question you'd like answered on the show, you can send it to podcast@iasusa.org to be answered in a future episode.